Welcome to JBC Auditorium for the 6th plenary session on towards a synodal church models. In this session, there are 6 presentations by 6 experts. Let me welcome Professor Peter Knox to chair this session. Professor Peter Knox is a Catholic priest and he holds a doctorate in theology from St. Paul University, Ottawa. At present, he is a senior lecturer in systematic theology at Hekima University College, Nairobi. He has several academic publications in his credit. Over to you, dear professor.
Thank you very much, Joby, and thank you for being here. And to our panelists, thank you for volunteering to speak to us today. We have an entire geographical spread from east to west. We have every continent covered, and so the wealth of experience at this table, except in the middle here, the wealth of experience is enormous, and so we're looking forward to hearing all of your contributions. We'll start with Father Francis, Dr. Francis Appiah Kubi.
Good afternoon to you all. My reflection is on towards being and building a synodal church African model. And the paper is divided into 3 parts. I've been asked to do a cross-survey of the reception of the announcement of synodality in Africa, after which I will talk a bit about towards being and building a synodal church. And then the last point will treat relationality as key element towards building a synodal church in Africa. The Synod on Synodality has received impressive reactions across Africa. There have been workshops on continental, regional, national, diocesan, deanery, and parish levels, even including small parishes. These workshops were in the form of virtual conversations, conferences, group discussions. Catholic universities and seminaries across West Africa, for instance, organized study sessions for the same purpose. In some countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal, several categories of persons like farmers, traders, victims of war, illiterates, all had opportunity to share their views. This indicates that the synodality has been brought to the doorsteps of each and every Christian in the church in Africa. From the 25th to 29th of July, at this general meeting at Jimpa in Accra, in Ghana, the Symposium of Episcopal Conferences of Africa, Madagascar, that is SECAM, reflected on the African model of synodality. Besides, the prefect of Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, Cardinal Cheney, proposed an approach that is to be appropriate for the synodal process in Africa. And I quote, "It is in working together that relationships are built and strengthened. Through working together, those who get tired along the way are encouraged, supported, and guided to continue the journey. Hence, through this work, we learn and discern together," end of quote. In appreciating the e-book that was also launched in September 28, entitled "A Pocket Companion to Synodality, Voices from Africa," the same cardinal notes that as the church wants to keep going far while entering into the pedagogy of walking, there is the need to implement the African proverb which says, "If you want to go fast, walk alone. But if you want to go far, work together. The regional conferences of West Africa, RECOWA, on an online workshop on African synodality, emphasized also the uncompromising dignity and role of the laity in building a listening and participatory church. All participants, from the pastoral perspective of African context, were of the view that the paradigm church family of God echoes perfectly the communion, participation, and mission of a synodality of the church. The Catholic Bishops' Conference of Sudan and South Sudan also, on October 13, 2022, highlighted the training of catechists as agents of peace and reconciliation. We want, I quote, we want the catechists to be agents of peace and reconciliation in order to reduce violence and communal conflicts. Similarly, in Ghana, the National Laity Council also highlighted on listening and dialoguing with other religions, especially traditional and Islamic religions. Remarkably, about 20,000 people in the Diocese of Bauchi alone in Nigeria participated in the synod conversations. In-person meetings were the method applied. Participants were grouped according to their various pious societies, tribal groups, and also through the major organizations in the church. Father Rodrigue Bejenu, a synod team leader from Benin, insinuated that Catholics of Benin are eager to promote co-responsibility for the church. In the same way, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Congo-Brazzaville emphatically affirmed that synodality is a pastoral imperative. Father George Kalanga also believes that the input from the synodal process in DR Congo will contribute to a larger program of education for living together as family. From the 18th to 23rd July, the Pan-African Congress on Theology, Society, and Pastoral Life also organized a congress in Nairobi on the theme, Working Together for a Vital Church for Africa and the World, during which I gave a talk. The Congress contribution to building synodal church in Africa oscillates around some key lessons. For instance, formation of agents of evangelization, especially catechists, the leaderships, and the active faithful, lay faithful. In all, Congress evokes some challenging issues, like dichotomy between orthodoxy and orthopraxy, tribalism, wars. It insists on listening to dialogue, listening to discern, and listening to harmonize doctrine with praxis. The second point, now towards being and building a synodal church African model. The African paradigm of the church family of God understands the church in the plan of God, realized through history. It unveils the gratuitous intervention of God, which connotes the ideas of incarnation, vocation, filiation, covenant, belongingness, and promises. It is the family of the families, which journeys in the world and has as its goal to gather together all the scattered children of God, to bring them into the Father's house. The church is family of God by nature and fraternity by vocation, and nothing of what concerns humanity, nothing of what humanity discovers in suffering or in happiness is foreign to the church. As a synodal church, it shares the sufferings and the joys of her children as it journeys through tough and thin. As a synodal church, Members are striving to reject all that damages humanity and disfigures God, such as the traditional network of ethnocentrism, racism, tribalism, favoritism, which disrupts the progress of synodal church. The tribal opposition sometimes endanger peace and create difficulties for working together as a synodal church. Indeed, no reflection on the theology of the church family of God, as well as no elaboration of pastoral strategy in view of building a synodal church in Africa, in today's Africa, can escape this thorny phenomenon which hinders every ecclesial action. The last point, rationality as key element towards building a synodal church in Africa. The acknowledgement of the revelation of God as Father overthrows any relationship of superiority and competition in the church. The relationship of filiation and fraternity must substitute the relationship of master-slave. The only attitude which corresponds to the Word of God is that of sons and daughters, children born from God, participating in the divine filiation of the only Son, Christ. The theology of the church family of God, in which is discovered our affiliation to God the Father and fraternal bond to one another in Jesus Christ, has a capacity to transcend not only differences, tribal and ethnic particularism, but also that capacity to unite us in one family as the church works together. The effect of self-feeling of superiority is dramatic for humans, as we all know in Africa. A modus vivendi is still possible. That is what the dialogue among cultures through the synodal process wishes to suggest. Conclusion. The African Christological paradigm family of God is in perfect consonance with the reality of synodality, which stresses communion, participation, and mission. The Synod on Synodality has therefore become a kairos, a moment of grace for the church in Africa to critically re-examine itself and its internal mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Francis. Now from Africa, we go to Australia. I've just discovered that Father James is in the same diocese as my sister in Adelaide, so we've got a connection here. Father James, that's nothing to do with synodality, but we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, what a joy. In fact, his sister lives up the road from a parish that I served in for many years. Great. So a few words about synodality in Australia and the Fifth Plenary Council. This is brief, 12 minutes, and clearly speaking about an event of this size needs to be clipped, so it's brief, but nonetheless I hope you get the key lines of thought. And it's an utter joy to be here in Damarana at this first-rate conference. I've really been moved by many of the papers. So to mine, the Fifth Plenary Council between 2018 and 2022 was a major event in the life of the Catholic Church in Australia. 5 months after its concluding Eucharist, Bishop Shane McKinlay, the Council's Vice President, claimed that perhaps the Council's primary achievement has been a significant advance in the development of a synodal culture in Australian ecclesial life. This paper identifies some aspects of that cultural shift. It describes the plenary council process and identifies some of its contributions and challenges. Yet it begins by noting relevant elements of ecclesial life since Vatican II that both contributed to and detracted from a synodal church. So, synodality after Vatican II. As Vatican II's fourth session began, Pope Paul VI established the Synod of Bishops with the primary aim of fostering the benefits of the Council, thus ensuring a more regular practice of synodality for the universal church between ecumenical councils. We've had a lot of reflection during this conference too about what that synodality consisted of there and what Pope Francis is leading us to now as a far more developed reality. The 2023 Synod on Synodality is the 16th Ordinary General Synod of the Synod of Bishops, or the Ordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops, and the Australian bishops have been represented at each of these. Yet since the Synod of Marriage and Family, 2014-15, Pope Francis has extended the practice of synodality, insisting that the consultative process include the whole ecclesial community. On the 50th anniversary of the Synod of Bishops, as we've heard in nearly every paper these days, Francis saw this listening process including, quote, the faithful people, the College of Bishops, the Bishop of Rome, all listening to each other and all listening to the Holy Spirit. While prior to 2015, the language of synodality was not commonly used in reference to consultative bodies of local churches, in Australia, diocesan pastoral councils and parish pastoral councils were established in the wake of Vatican II, yet their operation has been very intermittent. 9 diocesan pastoral councils were established between 1966 and 1974, yet in 2001, of the 28 Australian dioceses, only 6 had functioning diocesan pastoral councils. The Archdiocese of Adelaide, and my archdiocese, has the most uninterrupted history, has a long practice of group discernment, with a diocesan pastoral council functioning from 1966 to 2017 and since 2021. Other significant sources for the development of the practice of synodality in the Church in Australia have been, firstly, the communal discernment practiced by religious congregations in light of Perfecte Caritatis, and secondly, the very popular See Judge Act method used by the Cardine-inspired movements such as the Young Christian Workers movement. Both of these realities have had enormous influence in my diocese, for example, and in other dioceses throughout Australia. And in the ones that are more synodally inclined now, you can see these practices, particularly, well, both, but the second is strongly present. So let me then just describe, just in a paragraph really, the process of the Plenary Council. The Australian Plenary Council extended over 4 phases. The first, called Listening and Dialogue, over 2018-19, asked Australian Catholics what the Spirit was saying to the Church, and 222,000 people responded either through group meetings and feedback or individually online, offering 17,457 submissions. Just as a way of locating that, the population of Australia is around 25 to 26 million, and Catholics form about 25% of that population at present. From these submissions in the first phase, 6 themes were identified and papers written, with these forming the basis of the small group discernment process that was the second phase, called Listening and Discernment, over 2019 to 21. The third, or celebratory phase, occurred over 2 assemblies. Approximately 280 members, 30% of whom were women, met for the first General Assembly in October 2021, held online due to the pandemic, and the second General Assembly held in Sydney, face-to-face, July 3 to 9, 2022, and that second assembly would vote on the Council's motions and decrees. The fourth, or the implementation phase, will follow Vatican recognition of the Council's decrees. So what can we learn? Here's my suggestions, contributions and challenges. In my view, reflection on two features of the Plenary Council can best contribute to global conversation on synodality. First, the process of spiritual conversation, we called it, around which the Council was designed. And secondly, the necessity of reading the signs of the times in the light of the gospel, a phrase with which we are deeply familiar. These two features contain both contributions and challenges for the global conversation on synodality. So to the first. Integral to the second phase of the Council and to the first and second assemblies was a process called spiritual conversation, an adaptation for groups of the Ignatian practice of spiritual discernment. At the Second Assembly in Sydney, which met over 6 days, and the 4 central days were the key ones, each of the 8 spiritual conversations, so 2 per day, consisted firstly of a biblical passage and a set of motions about one of the Assembly's key 8 themes, taking each in turn. Tables of 10, and those tables remained stable the whole week, including a facilitator engaged in each spiritual conversation for 45 to 60 minutes. The primary aim of the process was to discern what the Holy Spirit was saying through the group's prayer, reflection, and discussion. Firstly, the reading of the scriptural passage was followed by 5 minutes of silent meditation and then 3 rounds of members' contributions. First, without comment from other members, each one shared what they had heard in their own prayer and how that had left them feeling. Second, and again without comment, for about 2 minutes per person, members shared what they had discerned the Spirit saying through the voices of the group and how that left them feeling. And then third, an open conversation ensued about the import of the group's sharing for the motions under consideration. Since the Council, many members have spoken of this process as a transformative experience, and one that not only could be, but that should be usefully employed at every level of diocesan and parish life. Many talked about their parish councils being this sort of discernment process. It enabled members to speak of the movement of the Spirit in their own lives, but also to appreciate and learn from unfamiliar perspectives. This is a second feature of the Plenary Council, which I think can contribute to the global movement toward a synodal church, is Gaudium et Spes's challenge to read the signs of the times in the light of the gospel. Several of the Plenary Council's decrees urged reading of the signs of the times, including the decree on missionary discipleship, the decree on formation for mission, ministry, integral ecology, and reconciliation with Australia's First Nations people. Yet the major drama of the Second Assembly, and it was a drama, revolved around one of the key signs of the times since at least the second half of the 20th century. That is, recognizing the equal dignity of women and men. While the biblical witness to women's equal dignity is clear, and Pope Francis's teaching shows that he has a keen sense of the importance of this issue for the life of the Church, it was difficult for the Plenary Council to agree on a set of motions articulating how that teaching might be better established in Australian ecclesial life. Thankfully, by the conclusion of the Assembly, the Council members embraced a decree that sought to promote women's equal dignity in the Australian Church. So there are the 2 key features, again, incredibly briefly described within my 12-minute time limit. Thanks very much for your attention.
And thank you very much for sharing those 2 features with us, James. We'll have time later to get a little bit more details from you. Thomas, you're next. Thomas works for Missio in Aachen, so he's a very important man to know.
Well, thank you. Although the Catholic Church in the German-speaking countries of Central Europe, and due to time restrictions, I can't do more in this short time. Even although they do not have established synodal structures comparable to those of the Eastern churches, synodality in the very broad sense of a strong participation of the whole people of God with its many charisms in the mission of the Church, and especially in administrative matters, has a long tradition. Unlike to a holy and sacred synod like that of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem, to name but one, praxis and understanding of synodality in these countries focus more on the participation of lay people than on synodal procedures within the bishop's collegium. In most dioceses, lay pastoral ministers who are similar educated and formated like as priests and often employed and paid by the dioceses, lay pastoral ministers are strongly present and represented by boards or councils. Furthermore, a characteristic of the Catholic Church in Germany, Austria and Switzerland are the many associations of the faithful with an often important impact in society and politics, which is also valid for the many Protestant churches in these countries. And while in Austria and Germany these associations are organized in national councils of lay people, the so-called Zentralkomitee der deutschen Katholiken oder der Katholische Laienrat Österreichs, and they see themselves as the voice of the laity vis-à-vis the bishops, there's a special situation in Switzerland due to the particularities of Swiss state law, Swiss state church law. Since most cantons demand a democratic order and financial transparency for public law recognition with the possibility to collect church taxes, cantonal church organizations developed mainly in the course of the 19th century and constitute the Roman Catholic Central Conference of Switzerland. This constitutes a dual system with the bishops being responsible for pastoral questions and boards of lay people, for example, the Synodal Council in Zurich with Franziska Driessen-Reding as president. These boards of lay people deciding upon matters of finance, staff, and real estate management. The meetings of these councils are open to the public and its decisions are visible to all. You can download them via the internet. This dual structure applies also to the individual parish, and one of its most important consequences is that a bishop or a parish priest does not need to take care of many administrative matters and can concentrate on his pastoral tasks. Yet, if he needs money for a pastoral project, he needs the approval of the Synodal Council. Thus, in Switzerland, lay people can contribute to the mission of the Church with their administrative, economic, and organizational competence and work closely together with the clergy. Although this dual structure significantly reduces the power imbalance between clergy and laity, care must be taken that it does not lead to a bipolar juxtaposition or even an opposition, but that it stays in a collaboration in a synodal spirit. These questions of power and separation of powers and the consequences for joint participation and involvement in the mission of the Church are also a key aspect of the synodal way of the Catholic Church in Germany. This process stands in a tradition of several dialogue processes of the German Church, and it was started in autumn 2019 as a joint undertaking of the German Bishops' Conference and the Central Committee of German Catholics. It reacted to the so-called MHG study, that was a research project, sexual abuse of minors by Catholic priests, deacons, and male members of orders in the domain of the German Bishops' Conference, which was published 2018. And the issues and challenges mentioned in this report, especially concerning the clerical abuse of power and the systemic sources and cover-up of abuse, should be dealt with in this synodal process. Bishops and laity aimed for a synodal path with joint consultations and decision-making. Thus, they took up points from a document of the Central Committee of the German laity concerning synodality as a principle of structure of the Church, which was published 2016. Since this joint consultation and decision-making would not have been possible with a synod in the sense of a canonical plenary council, at least that would have needed a much longer preparation, they opted for a special construct allowing participation as well as preserving the canonical decision-making, or to be more precise, decision-taking authority of the bishops. Thus, the Synodal Assembly consists out of 230 members, including all German bishops, the diocesan as well as the titular ones, and an equal number of members of the Central Committee of German Catholics, representatives of religious orders, diocesan priests, deacons, young people, etc. There was also a phase of collection of submission of all faithful. The other bodies of the Synodal Powers, the Synodal Council, the Synodal Committee, the Extended Synodal Committee, the chairpersons, and also the spiritual accompaniers are also composed on a parity basis. Decisions and resolutions are taken by the Synodal Assembly and require a double two-thirds majority, first of the members present and second of the bishops present. However, the decisions of the Synodal Powers do not legally bind the bishops. They may bind them morally if they take seriously as we have heard, the question of baptism, the Holy Spirit, and also the Sensus Fidelium. So it does not legally bind the bishops, and if topics require an all-church regulation, they are to be understood as a vote that should be transmitted to the Apostolic See. Following up the MHD study, the Synodal Path deals with 4 central issues and fields of action. First, power and separation of powers in the Church, joint participation and involvement in the mission. Second, priestly existence today. Third, and Margaret Eckholt is a member of this forum, women in ministries and offices in the Church. And fourth, life and succeeding relationships, living love and sexuality and partnership. Since 2019, the Synodal Assembly met 4 times and decided upon several foundational texts as well as implementation texts that draw the consequences. While the 5th and last Synodal Assembly will take place in March 2023, not all topics and texts that were raised on the agenda then will have been decided upon. In view of this, a Synodal Council shall be established that further follow these questions. And although it is too early for a final conclusion, several points can be made on the basis of the previous assemblies and discussions. First of all, it is very hard to form a body that both is small enough to allow fruitful and productive discussions with all members being able to participate, with results that can be communicated, and on the other hand is big enough to be representative of at least most parts of the faithful of this local church. To a larger extent, in Germany, this is made easier by the many existing Catholic associations and societies, but on the reverse, this may lead to overlook the interests of Catholics who are not organized in those associations. Furthermore, the democratic way of appointing representatives in many associations has many advantages, for example, transparency, but it can also tend towards involuntarily discriminating minoritarian views, with the consequence of a synodal body being more homogeneous than the people of God of Germany. This is not only valid for dissenting theological positions, but also for underrepresenting Catholics with global or migratory backgrounds. Secondly, voting rules that allow for lay participation in decision-making and decision-taking by being in accordance with canon law and follow the democratic majoritarian principle imply, especially with regard to disputed topics, a high responsibility both for the majority and for the minority. While the majority must not exploit their majority to simply outvote the minority without dialogue, the minority is asked to duly introduce its position into the discourse. This can be alleviated by the composition of the working groups, preparing the texts for the assemblies, and by giving enough time for discussion. But first and foremost, it is a question of attitude. We have heard already some talks on the virtue behind synodality, of careful listening to dissenting views and their arguments, and of being willed and courageous to hold one's view and defend it argumentatively. Although this may not have been perfectly achieved in the German synodal path, it is a comforting sign that there is still debate and discussion and generally the acceptance of the other as a Catholic. And that is, in my opinion, one of the most important aspects of dealing with conflict in the church, of dealing with dissenting in the church, if it's framed by the recognition and the acceptance of the other as belonging to the same group, then you can have a very wide discussion and a very controversial discussion. Closely connected to this is the third challenge I want to mention. There's never enough time for all topics to be discussed, for all voices and arguments to be heard, for the building of trust, for spiritual discernment. Yet all this is necessary for a process with a truly synodal spirit of walking together. Thus, to have as much time as possible, such synodal processes must be strictly restricted to the most important issues, perhaps the foundational issues, and those that require a unified solution, perhaps with regard to the unity of the church. But as in ecumenical theology, one should not be too fast to declare topics as being of this importance, because it may also be possible to allow much more diversity, especially with regard to the different contexts, challenges, even in a rather small country like Germany, at least geographically, there are huge differences concerning the situation of the church. This means carefully discerning these topics, these foundational topics at the beginning of the process, and being willing to alter the topics if the discussions show that other topics are even more relevant. As in communication, disturbances should have priority. As a consequence, such an approach would also allow for plurality in many other matters. Thank you for your attention.
From Northern Europe, we go to Southern Europe. Father Carlo represents, or will be speaking on behalf of Portugal, Spain, Malta, and Italy, although he himself is Maltese. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues and friends, good afternoon. Before beginning my presentation, please allow me to express my deep gratitude to Reverend Professor Saji George Kochetura, CMI, and the other members of the organizing committee for inviting me to speak at this very important conference on synodality and to share my thoughts on the reception of synodality in Southern Europe. So before starting this presentation, I'd also like to add two preliminary remarks. First of all, as I was reading for this paper, I kept asking myself, why is it that in most of the documents issued by the Vatican, there's always reference to what St. John Chrysostom said, and that we've heard quoted at least twice this morning, that church and synod are synonymous, when he's commenting on Psalm 149. And also Pope Francis, whenever he refers to the synod, especially in his address to the 2015, in the year 2015, in the 50th anniversary of the institution of the Synod of Bishops, he says that the church is constitutive of the synod, and the synod is constitutive of the church. So I'd like to begin with a provocative question. Can we say that if we are not really practicing synodality, can we say that we are not even church? And the second preliminary remark is about these four countries, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Malta. And I asked myself, what is their common to these four countries? First of all, they all form part of Western Europe, which, as a result, they are strongly influenced by the Roman Catholic Church. And in fact, they all also speak Romance languages that are derived from Latin. Moreover, they are distinguished from the Northern European countries because they are Mediterranean. And this means that for thousands of years, they were also a melting pot of cultures, including a melting pot of religious cultures. And finally, these three countries face similar challenges. One of the main issues that we are facing at the moment is obviously the influx of migrants from Africa through the central Mediterranean route. And therefore, this is why I start the paper by saying that this paper can be regarded, in my opinion, as a survey of the vitality of the church in Southern Europe, whether it is alive or not, depending on whether it actually lives solidarity. And I'm going to be dividing this paper as follows. First, I analyze how the call for synodality has been received in these countries, and in what concrete ways they have responded to the call to build a synodal church. Then I list some challenges that the church needs to overcome, especially in these countries, if it is to remain true to its vocation of synodality. Finally, I recall significant moments of synodality from recent and also not so recent history, including both what I call formal initiatives of synodality, which are done by the institutional church, but I also look at what I call informal initiatives of synodality. So first, the reception of the call of synodality and how this was done. So what I did was that I analyzed the synodal synthesis documents that were issued by these 4 countries. Thank God for Google Translate for Portuguese and Spanish, which I do not speak. So analysis of these 4 documents suggests that by and large the call for synodality has been well received. In Malta, for example, several initiatives aimed at bringing together people from various walks of life. What was particular to these initiatives was that they did not simply seek to collect responses through questionnaires, but in most cases, people actually met together and shared their experiences in a prayerful atmosphere, followed by the compiling of common or significant elements. Thank you, Father James, for sharing with us what you did in Australia. That is exactly what we did as well. We practiced this spiritual conversation, and even in our seminary, if we have time, we'll discuss that as well. In Italy, participation was not limited only to local churches in their various articulations and modalities, but also included an effort to reach also the worlds of politics, professions, right up to the places of suffering and care and institutions of solitude and the marginalized. In Spain, the synodal process extended so far as to include also 19 prisons, as well as the experiences of Catholic immigrants. As far as I know, this was the only instance where this was done, at least in these 4 countries. They also produced a brief document of persons who do not feel that they have an active part in the church. They issued a document on how to receive feedback from them in Spain. Despite several limitations that Portugal reported, partly due to COVID or apathy from the side of priests especially, we've heard this before and we'll be hearing more about it later, several creative methods were used to listen to persons from different demographic categories. In many dioceses or episcopal conferences, the response to the synod coincided with other ecclesial journeys that were being undertaken in the same dioceses. For example, in our archdiocese, the Archdiocese of Malta, initiatives linked to the 4-year process of ecclesial renewal. Likewise, in Italy, the response to the call for synodality coincided with another synodal process held for the whole of the Italian Church, with an emphasis on listening. Some points from each synthesis can offer a reasonable overview of the main issues raised. I'm not going to stay going through the list. You can follow them from the book that you have in your hands. In Italy, they identified 10 nuclei, which, once again, I won't list them, but you have them written there in front of you. And you'll see that there are many common elements. 2 particular realities emerged from the Spanish synodal process. First, the Church on the Way, which emphasized the voice of the Spirit within the Church, and the Church going out, or the outgoing Church, rather, that is expressed as dialogue in the world. Moreover, several other themes that had a strong resonance in the synodal process emerged, including the role of women in the church, young people, family, abuse, including sexual, abuse of power, or abuse of conscience, lay ministries, dialogue, among others. The Portuguese experience, in turn, revealed a wide variety of observations about the church. Most of them identify more than 18 areas where renewal is needed. For example, a church that finds it difficult to make progress with the young people. A church with an attitude that is too hierarchical, too clerical, as we've said this morning. The synthesis also reproduces a vision of the church and current proposal for change, consisting of several proposals to respond to the challenges just mentioned. I'm going to mention now some challenges that these countries have encountered. The difficulties encountered of all 4 countries were quite similar. The relatively low response rate compared with the overall wider picture exposed the limitation of weak dissemination strategy and the inability to simplify the explanation of the relevance and dynamics of the synodal consultation. Portugal, for example, highlighted how this resulted in an inability to reach people who do not fall within the dynamics of the parish. And some communities had little or no information on the synod because they are not framed in ecclesial realities despite being Christians. So how did they respond positively to this call for a synodal church? I'm just going to give one example. An example from Barcelona, a parish, the parish of Sant'Anna in Barcelona, where they created this activity. One such example took place in this parish where a gathering was organized for priests, religious and lay persons. During this meeting, the results of a study coordinated by the well-known Benedictine nun, Teresa Forcades, had conducted and had gathered the voices of 500 persons from 40 cities around the world living in situations of poverty. They presented their opinions as well at this particular conference. How synodality was experienced in the past. Now, here I'm going to present 2 kinds. The first kind is what I call formal, and the second kind, informal practices of synodality. So the former, that is, formal practices of synodality, are those initiatives initiated by the hierarchy to open up broad areas for the participation of the laity, whose specific responsibilities in the church they define. This is a quote from John Paul II, Tertio Millennio Adveniente. Since the Second Vatican Council, there have been several initiatives of pastoral synods in the southern European countries, especially in Italy. Until 2005, there were 80 dioceses. And the pastoral synod that was held in Malta, we are still reaping, thank God, its fruit. That was held almost 20 years ago. An example of informal practices of synodality, I would mention the long pilgrimages that used to be done in Southern Europe. We know that in Southern Europe there are many antique places, shrines, where many people used to do pilgrimages. And therefore, there you have people who come from different walks of life. They come together, they spend days, weeks, sometimes months, walking together, living this experience together. People from all strata and society. Isn't that also an example, an experience of the church? And in fact, there was also a paper presented precisely on this. They would celebrate the Eucharist together. And there are many other similar examples that we can look at from the past, and that can help us try and think whether there were other practices that can engender the virtues of synodality, which is, after all, what we are really after, a real expression of the church, even if not directly related to the institutional church, or perhaps, let's say, an outshoot of what the institutional church is proposing. 3 challenges ahead. I don't know whether I have time to go through them. I can conclude simply with the conclusion. Despite the challenges faced, there was a strong appreciation, I believe, from what I've read, of the synodal journey across all 4 countries. In Italy, the synodal process showed that the church can truly be home to all. In Spain, they reported that the entire process was marked by a conviction that by walking, a path was made. The Portuguese synthesis described the process as the experience of being able to pray and walk together. Meanwhile, the Maltese synthesis brought to the fore how the process was indeed a planting of dreams. In 2014, Pope Francis had addressed the European Parliament in Strasbourg, and he had described Europe as old and sterile. I don't like the pejorative use of these words, but I think that if we look at how the synod is being accepted or received in certain situations, we can say that we can be a bit hopeful and that the embers of faith still burn under these ashes. These countries can renew the synodal nature of the church if they return to the roots and practices that have characterized them in the past. Thank you for your patience and attention.
Father Carlo, it's good to hear from the south of Europe. We're going to hear now from the south of the Americas with another, this time Father Carlos, not Carlo, Schickenberg. You're welcome, Father.
Thank you, Father Shaki, for the invitation, and thank you for all the people who belongs to the organization of this wonderful meeting. Yeah? So, Latin America and the Caribbean. Similarly to other presentations from this Congress, the presentation that at hand has certain limitation which should be noted from the beginning. On the one hand, this reflection takes on the perspective of Latin America and the Caribbean. It includes all the countries from a large continent, 33 countries, home to almost 600 million people. Although its diversity is not as great as that of Asia or other continents, the regional culture and linguistic differences are significant nonetheless. Fortunately, we have become increasingly more aware of this. Besides the challenge that the diversity of situation in the continent posed to the brief presentation of this reflection, the issue of synodality presents further difficulties to a brief presentation. This ecclesiological concept we have learned in these days encompass in some ways or another every aspect of the life of the church, and describing such a wide reality in few words is not easy. Consider the title of this Congress, Towards a Synodal Church Moving Forward, which emphasizes a view towards the future. I would like to respond to this specific issue with the following reflection. In the context of recent ecclesial experience in my region, where can we visualize new starting points? What processes, events, and institutions might be revealing the emergence of a renewed ecclesiological view with less clerical and hierarchical features and with a wider, more synodal participation? That's a question I want to answer with my presentation. Where can we discover new way of proceeding in a more synodal way? That's the point. At the end, I make a brief reference to the major obstacles that must be overcome in order to move towards the desired synodal direction. The answer to the question about the new starting point is threefold. The first aspect is the processes of listening to the people of God in the different ecclesial assemblies and synods that took place the past few years. The second one is the first ecclesial assembly of Latin America and the Caribbean, which was carried out in November 2021. And the third is the creation of a new intermediate ecclesial structure, the Ecclesial Conference of the Amazon Sea region, which came as a result of the Synod for the Amazon region celebrated in Rome in October 2019. The first point, processes of listening to the people of God in the different ecclesial assemblies and synods. The preparation for the Synod of the Amazon region celebrated in Rome included a truly exemplary phase of inquiry and listening. The inquiry was organized by the Pan-Amazonian Ecclesial Network, an official organization created in 2013 to coordinate the action of the church in the region. RIPAM carry out assemblies and several national and regional forums about different social, ecological, and ecclesial topics. The process engaged tens of thousands of people in a dialogue which resulted in a very good text, the Instrumentum Laboris, that served as a preparation for the Synodal Assembly. The Amazon Synod was not without its limitation, which can even be seen in the papal exhortation, Beloved Amazon, especially in the ecclesiological section, but still the general process can be regarded as a step forward in an international synodal experience. The preparation for the first Ecclesial Assembly of Latin America and the Caribbean was carried out in November 2021, constitute a similar procedure of inquiry about and listening to the opinion and desire of people. Notwithstanding the difficulties presented by the pandemic and the subsequent need to make the inquiry online, this preparatory phase is also noteworthy. If we revisit the Word document based on this listening exercise encompassing the expressions at time even literal of many peoples and groups, we can get a good picture of the significance of this event. It is also true, however, that this inquiry reached a limited number of people, as can be confirmed by the process of the Universal Synod currently in place. Furthermore, the question remains open over whether this course of action has a real impact in the lives of the church. In any case, there is a certain novelty and importance that cannot be denied. These processes entail a deeper lay involvement, enable wider interaction between the people of God instead of solely between the bishop and the pope, give relevance to the voices of local churches, and grant more attention to the actual problems of the region and territories involved. Here we can see very clear how a synodal program is a decolonial program. That's very important. It's an intrinsic link between synodality and decolonization. That's important for the state of the question in the social science in our region and in other parts of the world. Second, a new kind of continental ecclesial assembly with representation of all the people of God. The life of the church in our continent after Vatican II was marked by a series of episcopal conferences of Latin America and the Caribbean. Particularly, as you know, the Conference of Medellin, 1968, was regarded in our region as the birth certificate of a church with regional consciences. Together, Vatican II and Medellin are an inseparable symbolic unit which explain, in part, the overwhelmingly positive reception of the Council in our region. The origin of the most relevant ecclesial, theological, and pastoral dynamics nowadays is based on those initiatives from the 60s, which define the profiles of the churches in Latin America and the Caribbean. Despite the importance of Medellin that I have underlined and the subsequent conference, there is an ecclesial limitation that should not be ignored. Even if they had inquiry process of certain scale, there were exclusive meetings of the continental bishops. thus the significance of the events that occur for the first time in 2021. At Pope Francis' express request, the Sixth Episcopal Conference was not carried out. Instead, the First Ecclesial Assembly of Latin America and the Caribbean came to be. The distribution of the participants was as follows. That's interesting too. 20% bishops, 20% religious men and women, 20% priests, and 40% lay people, of which 10% belong to the sector known as existential periphery. I don't have time to develop the importance of this point for the comprehension of our region, the option for the poor as a key hermeneutical point of view in order to read the sign of the times in the light of the tradition of the church. No? The fact that this conference was not comprised solely by bishops cannot be undervalued. There are several unanswered questions and errors to solve, but this new type of ecclesial assembly represents a step towards a more synodal perspective. And third, a new synodal regional institution. The third initiative to be mentioned is the creation of the new ecclesial structure, which came as a result of the Synod for the Amazonian region. After a long studying process, a shared discernment and inquiry with relevant people and institutions, mainly with Pope Francis, the Ecclesial Conference of the Amazonian region was proposed as a new regional institution. The conference is a mixed, representative, and permanent ecclesial group composed of bishops and other peoples from the Amazon churches who are not members of the Episcopal College. It is constituted by the 7 Episcopal Conference, regional institutions such as Caritas, the Confederation of Latin American Religions, inclusive indigenous people. Therefore, this represents a model of renewal of collegiality in the light of synodality concerning a particular territory comprised by several countries. There are several published works that present the ecclesial, theological, and legal significance of this new ecclesial structure. I'm finishing. The experience that I have underlined do not erase the great obstacles that a renewed ecclesial, theological, and pastoral vision must face. There are two aspects that stand out, as we have seen in our conversation. There are deep and global problems, but there are our problems too, deep problems. First, the deep-rooted clerical mentality that reached through several layers of the lives of the church in the continent. Second, machismo, say we in Spanish too, is also deeply rooted in Latin American societies, and it manifests as a lack of gender consciousness in the Latin America church. That's a huge problem that we have. These two issues represent the great obstacles to overcome in order to shape a synodal church that respects the charismas, gift, and service of every faithful person living the mission of the church in our complex political and social situations. To sum up, despite these obstacles, the three examples presented here testify for a phase of ecclesial renewal, although it is only an initial stage. They represent new courses of actions and constitute new institutions in line with the issue of this Congress. They are open starting points towards a new developments that align with the title of our meeting, towards a synodal church moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Carlos. And from the south, we go to the north of the states, of the Americas. And JC is going to give us our final talk.
So at a recent Vatican press conference, Luxembourg Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich quoted U.S. priest Father Michael Ryan from St. James Cathedral in Seattle to capture the different sentiments of the ongoing synodal process in the United States. Father Ryan expressed how, when, quote, reading over the reports and reflecting on them, I found myself thinking how blessed I am to be a pastor of a parish that is full of people who love the church so much that they embrace it, affirm it, celebrate it, and thank God for it, but at the same time are not at all afraid to criticize it, challenge it, question it, and express anger, disappointment, and frustration with it. I think our parish can never be quite the same as a result, and I'm willing to bet the same is true for the entire church. As someone who was part of the Seattle Archdiocesan Pastoral Council during the initial listening sessions, these words capture the complexity of emotions that accompany the process. Nevertheless, the synodal process throughout the United States has been somewhat uneven. While dioceses such as Seattle, Washington, D.C., and New Jersey have been very proactive in planning listening sessions, they are also seen as ones led by bishops who are allies of Pope Francis's reforming agenda. Meanwhile, Catholics in other dioceses receive little to no information about the synodal process. Moreover, when the USCCB met in November 2021, they focused more on the Eucharistic coherence document than the global invitation to synodality that Pope Francis had issued a month earlier. Because all the energy was focused on if and how the document should address pro-choice politicians, the lack of attention on synodality seemed like a missed opportunity to prepare the U.S. Church for the synodal process. Considering these issues, I wish to offer some observations and lessons according to 3 related themes that emerged in the U.S. National Synthesis, sent to Rome earlier this year. 1, the intrusion of sociopolitical polarization. 2, the aftermath of the clerical sex abuse crisis. And 3, the wounds of racism. So 1, the intrusion of sociopolitical polarization. The unevenness in focus and energy is reflected in the numbers that participated in the synodal process. Although there are 66.8 million Catholics in the U.S., the voice of only 700,000, or 1.05%, were recorded in the National Synthesis sent to Rome. While all 178 Latin archdioceses submitted reports, the Eastern Catholic Churches submitted, or eparchies submitted separate reports, the lack of robust participation points to the growing issue of polarization in the U.S. Catholic Church. As Seattle Archbishop Paul Aitchen mentioned during one of our pastoral council meetings in August 2020, quote, society has become leaven in the church, rather than church becoming leaven in society. The synthesis further reflects this awareness as participants reflected on the deep sense of pain and anxiety associated with these divisions. As one participant shared, divisive political ideologies present in our society have seeped into all aspects of our lives, including the celebration of the Eucharist. Despite belonging to a global church, almost every issue is seen through the American political binary of liberal and conservative, including one's liturgical preference for the ordinary or extraordinary form. Eminent Catholic ecclesiologist Richard Gallardi argues that such identitarian polarization is a clear impediment to synodality because it is not simply about disagreement, but about the inability to address disagreements constructively within a larger framework of mutual respect. Part of this inability results from the ways in which people have come to identify with their positions as part of their sense of self, and therefore feel threatened by any form of critique that feels like an attack on their personhood. In the US, the Christian faithful would benefit from a deeper examination of conscience that asks what is the source of their identity in Christ, and how this baptismal initiation into the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus reorients them to all other identity labels in their lives, both within the church and in society. Part 2, the aftermath of the clerical sex abuse crisis. In addition to the impact of sociopolitical polarization, the U.S. church continues to bleed from the deep wounds of the clerical sex abuse crisis, which has emerged in 3 waves in the past century. While the National Catholic Reporter wrote the first expose in 1985, bringing the matter into public consciousness, it was the 2002 release of 10,000 pages of records by the Boston Archdiocese to a local Boston judge that catalyzed an investigation into all the hierarchy's cover-ups from 1985 to 2002. The latest wave was prompted by 2 investigations in 2018, the first of which included the New York Times report of both the predatory behavior of Cardinal McCarrick as a priest and bishop and the institutional knowledge of his abusive behavior. In August of the same year, the Pennsylvania grand jury revealed that approximately 1,000 children had been abused across 6 dioceses. Each of these waves bear painful revelations that weaken trust in the church. As the national synthesis indicates, quote, the sin and crime of sexual abuse has eroded not only trust in the hierarchy and the moral integrity of the church, but also created a culture of fear that prevents both ordained and lay ministers from developing close relationships with people because of the possibility of being misinterpreted or falsely accused. Indeed, as Catholic historian Massimo Fagioli puts it, the current synodal process, initiated by Pope Francis's pontificate, cannot be understood outside of the epic-changing abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, one of the signs of the times the pastoral constitution Gaudium et Spes of Vatican II talks about. Part 3, the wounds of racism. Finally, after the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020, the U.S. Catholic Church can no longer remain silent on the particularly virulent forms of racism that has marked U.S. society from before its founding. Responding to the social unrest following this murder, Pope Francis affirmed that the Church cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion in any form, and yet claim to defend the sacredness of every human life. While the U.S. Catholic bishops attempted to address the issue of racism in their 2018 pastoral letter, Open Wide Our Hearts, the letter failed to address the responsibility of the Church in contributing to racism or to take seriously the concerns of Catholics of color who have been harmed around the Eucharistic table. After the profound racial reckoning of 2020, the national synthesis finally acknowledges both how Catholics of color spoke of routine encounters with racism, both inside and outside the church, and how Indigenous Catholics spoke of the generational trauma caused by racism and abuse in boarding schools. Black Catholic theologian Brian Massengale argues that while Catholic teaching is unanimous in denouncing racism as a sin, it does not account for the interpersonal and social consequences of America's original and most enduring sin. Racism is not simply about personal prejudice, but a soul sickness that necessitates hard conversations that move the faithful to greater conversion. Conclusion. In the face of all these divisions, however, the synodal process has left a sense of hope through the initial cultivation of a new set of ecclesial habits, primarily that of communal listening and discernment. As Gallardi notes, Jesus' radical practice of open table fellowship, refusal to judge the adulterous woman, and teaching to pray for one's enemies refuses the possibility of an us versus them binary in the church. By growing in this conviction under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, may the church discover in greater depths what it means to be leaven in society and pilgrim in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, JC. In the time of Jules Verne, it took 80 days to go around the world. It's taken us 72 minutes to go around the world. And we congratulate all of our panelists and thank you for sticking to the time that we agreed. The floor is now open for questions. Remember, we're dealing about models of church, models of of synodality. There's no right model or wrong model, but we can learn from each other's experience. We'll address questions specifically to one of the presenters, and I request that as you do make your question, you present yourself, you announce who you are, where you're from, etc. Thank you. So we'll begin with a round of 3.
I'm Delfo Canceran from the Philippines. Since I observed that the speakers come from both the North and the Global South, I will focus on that relationship. It was mentioned by Carlos in passing, the colonial experience. I'm interested, how do you connect the colonial legacies with synodality? I remember the colonial scholars speak loudly of epistemicide, the death of the native knowledge, or epistemic injustice, the discrimination of native knowledge. How, if ever, could we dialogue, talk with those dead knowledges, if they are still recoverable? Or what happened to the global North? Is there a sense of metanoia in relation to this global South? So how do you connect synodality with coloniality? Thank you.
I'm Sister Margaret. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, how seriously have you taken the interfaiths and the inter-churches or interdenominational realities in our synodal journey of the church across the globe?
I'm George from Nairobi, Kenya. I address my question to Professor Francis from Ghana. Among the many obstacles that you have mentioned is racism, tribalism, and all that. I would like you to elaborate a little bit about the role and the responsibility of the church, the African church in that matter, in issues to do with the civil wars, corruption, that is at the highest level. What is the role of the church in matters politics?
Let's begin with Carlos and the question of decolonization.
Yeah, no? I could say briefly so. Maybe one of the most principal demands of the post-colonial or decolonial thought is the recognition of the authority of the local knowledge and wisdoms and experience. And that's exactly what the synodal process is trying to do, to offer space to hear new local voices from above, not a top-down dynamic from the center to the margins. A synodal process is a process from the margins to the center, from the local communities in order to the universal dialogue. So for me, it's very important to see this essential decolonial ingredient that belongs to the synodal processes. It speaks very well for synodality if you can link these two issues. So synodality is not only an inter-ecclesial issue, has a very strong political, cultures, repercussions in reconfigurations, the maps of the church and the global society. I think that's a proof of the wisdom of synodality.
The next question was addressed to everyone.
So I just wanted to say I really appreciated when Carlos said that synodality is about decoloniality. My heart was singing, and I appreciate your question, because I think what I observed, especially in the US, is I think this first round of synodality is just getting used to the habits of listening. But I noticed, especially, and I pushed from the Seattle Archdiocese, I pushed us to include demographics of who was included, because what had ended up happening was that of the, I think we had 1,000 sessions in Seattle alone, the demographics, it was actually mostly elderly white women who were the majority. And we had to and I was, trying to foster a sense of consciousness. Why were the migrants, especially, not involved? What are the obstacles to them feeling a part of the church here in the U.S.? And many, my conclusion is that many migrants, absolutely faithful Catholics, are treated as second class, is not fully seen as fully an American Catholic. And so part of that, migratory histories are related to colonial processes, right? It's sort of the boomerang effect of people coming from the global south to the global north. And so there is this sort of racial dimension that I wanted to uplift in terms of how people are feeling silenced and not fully part of the church. And that's a continuation of colonial logics that we need to be aware of. So.
Great. Can I respond then to Peter? And I wasn't thinking in those terms at that time, but one of the first set of motions that the Australian Plenary Council passed was that of an attempt by the Catholic Church in Australia to recognise more deeply our First Nations people, the Indigenous people of the country, and clearly that's one of our great sins too in Australia. A person who has advocated for them strongly for decades now, a Jesuit priest, Frank Brennan, has walked with the First Nations people, supported them, spoken publicly for them, and had a strong hand in developing this set of motions. And he, in dialogue with the First Nations people who were there present, was saying that they thought that this may fail, that it would go down. But indeed, it received unanimous approval in the Plenary Council. So I guess to reiterate or to reinforce Peter's point that synodality, the sense of the faith of the people of God, is profound and speaks in those sorts of decolonial ways. Thank you.
There was a question directly addressed to me, and this question of also colonialism. Sorry, I have to be a bit frank. Those of us who knew whose ancestors were colonized, we still carry along. I don't know whether it's in the committee for colonialism to take place, that everywhere people see you, they think you are inferior to the masters. Recently, at the death of Queen Elizabeth, on the TV in London, they showed the former president, the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, dancing with the Queen when she visited Ghana for the first time. Then the journalists immediately commented, look, the Queen is dancing with the slave, a former slave, and the colonial person. This is just recent criticism. It's a reality that has happened. So there's this kind of theology, decolonizing theology, whatever it is going on. From my own personal point of view, and as a Christian, and as a theologian, and using this African model, Church Family of God, we try as much as we can to let us understand that all of us are children of God, no matter what history has left for us, and that everyone has been called by God. That is why since morning some talk about baptism, that have made us share in the divine filiation. We'll become children of God, and all of us are brothers. And at the end of the last part of my talk, I said within that model, there's no master-slave, no superiority, no what. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, it is there, but as we are being called as Christians, we need to go beyond that. Because the moment I attach myself to that kind of, what do you call it, the tag, to this kind of attitude, it means I'm going to demonstrate a negative attitude to my Christian faith. And whilst I'm a victim, I'll become another victim for a second time. And so I personally don't feel I have to be a victim of it. Neither you have to be a victim. Both the colonial and the colonized are supposed to be converted. On the same thing applies to what we called, my brother asked, the question of racism, role and responsibility of the church because the African is so corrupt. This is a huge, huge, huge problem. Corruption in our politics, in our economies, of Africa. Let me talk about my own, which I know very well. It's a huge problem. It poses a big question on Christian identity. I've been imagining whether we are Christians or not, whether we do believe that we, all of us, are brothers and sisters in the church. Because once after the church, what happens outside there in the society, nothing demonstrates that we are Christians. Else we will not be corrupting and stealing state monies and the rest. And I always tell the politicians in Ghana, those of you at the parliament house there, parliamentarians, there's none who is a traditional priest. Nobody's a traditional priest. All of you are Christians. The traditionalists whom you have been condemned by your religion, they never steal. So what kind of teaching, what kind of lesson do you give to them? So it's a big, huge problem for Christianity in Ghana. A family, a church that calls itself a family, we need to help those our brothers and sisters in the same society. The same goes with the interfaith, but here I'll talk about interreligious dialogue because that's what's pertaining more to Africa. We live with our brother Muslims. And one of the countries I cited, that is Senegal, majority Muslim. Yet, there is serious understanding between Christians and Muslims in Senegal. It's a different model altogether. They welcome us as priests for meeting the West African priests. We were lodged in a Muslim hotel. Normally they don't drink alcohol, but there was some alcohol there, some knife, schnapp and the rest. They said, because you people are Christians. And one man said, what am I supposed to gain if my daughter marries to a Christian and I say no, and she still loves that particular person? I'm doing harm to myself. If I hate the Christian, I'm hurting my daughter. And therefore, when we say we are family, it goes beyond, it's not blood family, please. Don't use that expression, it's not blood. It goes beyond blood. It's more sacramental bond than blood relation. So, in brief, this is what I would say. The challenges are there, and we need to face it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlo. Francis. Father Carlo wants to speak as well about the interfaith issue.
Actually, so I can say something about the interfaith and one of neocolonialism.
Thanks.
So regarding neocolonialism, I can speak from a Maltese perspective. We were mostly colonized throughout our whole history. However, what I can say, nowadays, that's why I raised the issue of migration at the beginning, that we are participating in this neo-colonialist, globalist system, economic system, that is actually serving as a pull factor to increase this kind of migration towards Europe, and also increasing this push factor from certain countries from where people are fleeing from persecution, or else because they do not have enough resources or because they just want a better life. So somehow we are all participating in this neo-colonialist reality. And I hope that, but much more work has to be done, that we strengthen this link between the Synod and the Catholic social teaching or social justice that was very strong over here. Interfaith and interdenominational. So interfaith, I do not recall that any particular initiatives have been taken, but yes, interdenominational, the small denominations that we have, I know that there have been some conversations with members from those denominations as well.
The interdenominational thing, in the German process, there are visitors from other churches present, and they can contribute in the discussion. So the perspective is not very present because they're only a small part of the whole assembly, but at least they are present at the discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we may have exhausted that first round of 3 questions. We have somebody just behind the bishop, and then the bishop. Okay.
You always give preference to bishops.
Oh, we do? Okay. There you are, Father. That's hierarchicalism.
The synodality, you should have done it. So blessed. See, good number of our Catholics are not coming to the church, especially the youngsters. And what steps you are taking going to them? Then the transgenders, single parents, differentially able children, they're all belonging to us. So what steps you are taking for them?
Thanks for your presentation, all the presentations, learning process. My question may be addressed to Thomas, because Thomas, we hear every now and then, we hear that German church is in the process of closing down by 2050. 2030, they have the cluster system. Cologne, I don't know exactly. I was told that there are some 1,200 parishes. By 2030, maybe some 60 parishes, cluster system, and many are going away from the church. So we speak very seriously about the synodality in the Catholic Church. What would be the ground reality in the church proper? I don't know exactly. That is one phase of my question. Second one is, now from India, thousands are migrating to Europe and all over the world, not only Catholics, not only Christians, Muslims, and especially to Germany, the number of Muslims. I am not against Muslims, I am all for Muslims. Just to want to say that, what would be, as somebody mentioned, the interfaith, you mentioned about interdenominational, what would be the attitude of the church authorities towards the interfaith people who come there, and what would be the attitude of the church as part of synodality? Few more questions are there, but many are waiting for tea break, so I conclude here. Thank you.
Yeah, I am Helen Saldana, Holy Spirit Missionary Sister from India. In the morning, we talked about intersectionality in one of the comments, and now we are again talking about going through the globe, actually. Asia, I suppose, is tomorrow. Following with the Bishop Joshua's question, the steps that are taken to involve intergenerational, population, and also referring to Floyd murder and aftermath, that the entire movement that when the youth participation, that was the church in some way. How do we take cue from there? That is one question. Could be answered by everyone also, if you may wish so. The second one is, when I think of synodality vis-a-vis decolonization, synodality is spoken so much in our church circles. Is it that simple that we connect the two to take it beyond the colonization, the hundreds of years of impact then and now we still have? And what could be certain solutions or guidelines that you could offer? Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Helen. One question was directed at one particular person, So we'll ask Thomas for his reply to that question, and then we'll have an open table for the last 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, I also can address very shortly the first questions, because in the German Assembly, Synodal Assembly of the Synodal Path, not the global process that has to be distinguished, there are present some youngsters coming from the German Association, or were nominated by the German Association of Young People. There's also persons who identify themselves as transgender, as non-binary, and propose their experiences to the assembly. So at least their perspective is voiced in this assembly. To the second question, indeed there is a prognosis that in several decades the number of German Catholics will be more or less half of the number that is now. The reasons are mainly two. The first one is general demographics. The German population is a very old one, so there's a prognosis of a general decline of the German population in several decades. The second one is that due to the special way in Germany, legal system, that it is possible to declare you can leave the church as institution as a Körperschaft des öffentlichen Rechts, the official legal term. You can leave it and you declare this before the state, for example, at the court. So the number of German Catholics reside from the official statistic of the state, and because of these two reasons, there's a prognosis in several decades the number will be by half, not at zero, but significantly less than now, and many dioceses are now in the process of adapting their structures, adapting their pastoral strategies to these prognoses. And concerning the interface issue, because it was once again mentioned, since the German Synodal Path was started as a reaction to the study that was dealing with the systemic, first identifying the cases and then also identifying the systemic causes of abuse. The interface perspective is not really taken into account because it just deals with other matters. In the synodal process, and the German contribution to the synodal process, the global synodal process, that might be another point, but I have not studied all the submissions, so I'm not really firm in which way the interface aspect is present in the German submission for the global process.
Thank you very much indeed, Thomas. The table is now open. We have the question on intersectionality, and we have the question on people at the existential margins. Would anyone like to reply to either of those? Okay, we'll give a final word to JC, because after this response, we're calling it a day.
Okay.
JC, please. Thanks.
Sure. So I was thinking about connecting the first question and the last question, and I think I want to share sort of maybe an experience. So when I was serving on the Seattle Archdiocesan Pastoral Council, we were doing listening sessions, and I reached out to the Black Catholic Circle, so African American Catholics, and I reached out to the Indigenous Catholics. Both were deeply resistant to speaking to the hierarchy. And I wanted to listen, and the reason was because of so many past wounds. They were saying, what, now you want to listen, but what hope do we have that anything we say will matter, right? And I had no guarantee to give them, but I think, in what I witnessed is in the slow building of trust over time, those of us that attended that listening session, and I really begged the Archbishop to come because it was very important for him to hear, right? But what many of us witnessed was, despite so much wrong done, especially to Black Catholics and Indigenous Catholics, which in a way we can say those are the colonized populations. If we have many immigrant populations, then we also have a particular, it's a different history, different wounds. But what we saw was how much Christ was actually present and has to be present if the church is not treating its children correctly, right? And how they're able to see through so much of our nonsense and find Christ still. And so what that means for us to really walk together in the history of our, in the US I can speak, but with the multiple histories that are entangled and wounded, right? And so to actually listen to those wounds and then to take responsibility as, as a family. That's not the paradigm that we have, but truly if we are all baptized into the same family, then we have to bear those wounds and respond. So I think that that's how I want to respond, in the sense that the capacity to receive the real hard truths is slowly developing, but it will take time. But also, just to Bishop's question, I was very happy in the U.S. Synthesis there were sections for those who are differently abled, for transgender, especially in the U.S. Synthesis. There's a lot of focus on or a need to hear the concerns of LGBTQ Catholics. So that was very present, and women's ordination as well. So those were all present in the synthesis as well. So.
Thank you very much, JC. Thank you very much, colleagues. We have a final word from our sponsors.
Thank you very much, dear professors, for your scholarly reflections on various models of synodal church. I appreciate and thank Professor Peter Knox for his systematic way of chairing this plenary session. Thank you, dear professors.